Morning YouTube! Last big push, just the rear suspension to strip and rebuild, and that is the mechanicals finished. It will be all over by Christmas.
So start by removing the brake caliper the way that we looked at in the last video, but if you're removing the suspension, don't clamp off at the outer flexible hose here like we did when we were removing the brake caliper. Instead, clamp it off at the inner flexible hose, which you can see just back there with the orange clamp on it, because that way you can remove the plumbing for the rest of the braking system with the rear suspension.
We need to remove the anti-roll bar in order to get the lower wishbone out. So get a 17mm socket on the nut at the top there and then just crack that off. But as soon as you've got it loose, then the whole ball joint will start turning there. So then you're going to have to get a 17mm spanner on it and then a smaller spanner on the flat at the top of the ball joint there to hold that still while you undo this nut. Just crack the nut off. There's been an attempt to replace this boot at the bottom in the past, and those flats are rounded off, so I can't get the nut off at the top. If that happens to you, because it is a little bit difficult, because you see that the nut starts to cover the flats that you're trying to hold off, but it's not the end of the world. Just basically get hold of the body, the metal body of the ball joint with a set of mole grips, and then at the bottom there's a 17mm nut on the bottom that holds the whole ball joint assembly to the wishbone. So just while you're holding the body to prevent it turning, undo the nut at the bottom, and then we'll take the whole ball joint assembly out, still connected to the wishbone, still connected to the anti-roll bar, and then we'll separate that nut off at the top on the bench. Now, I've got the other side off already, so all the tension's out of this anti-roll bar. Just be aware that if you're just removing one side at a time, or the first side you take off, there'll be quite a lot of tension in this, so it'll come off with quite a bang. Then undo this nut and bolt for the drop link with a 17mm socket, and then that's the anti-roll bar out of the way, and then the wishbone can come over the top of that bracket. And just pull the anti-roll bar off the rubber bush. There you go. Now with it off the car, you can see the problem with this anti-roll bar ball joint is that this shaft in the middle that you have to get hold of the flats of, it's not long enough, so the nut itself, the nylock itself, covers the flat, so you can't hold on to it anymore before you get the thing off completely. But with it off the car, it's really easy to deal with. Now we can just get a pair of mole grips on the rest of the ball joint and then undo it with a stop it turning and undo it with a spanner. If it really won't come undone, then just get a nut splitter on it and split the nut up. You've got to use a new nylock when you put it back together anyway. Working inside the boot, pull back the carpet and then undo the three nylocks here, here and here that hold the top of the suspension strut into the chassis turret. Don't undo the one in the middle though yet, don't undo that one. Then remove the lower bolt for the strut with a 19mm socket and spanner. Then remove the bolt, and at that point the strut is free to come out. Now, it will, if all you want to do is remove the strut and you don't want to dismantle the rest of the suspension, it will just about come out, but to be honest it's a bit of a fight. You'll have to really lever the lower wishbone right down and then sort of wrestle the strut out, and it will just about come out. A pair of spring compressors on the spring, just to compress the spring by about an inch, will help you get it out. But in this case, because we're going to take the lower wishbone off anyway, I'm just going to leave it in there loose and then we'll take it out when we remove the lower wishbone. We need to undo the inner flexible hose where it connects to the solid pipe that runs along the lower wishbone here. Now with any old brake pipe like that, heat is your key to success here, to getting it off without breaking it or rounding it off. So we're just going to get a blowtorch on it for 30 seconds, which will dramatically improve your chances of getting it undone without damaging it. Because the pipe is hollow, if you lean on it hard, you're always in danger of cracking it. There you go. Simples! Lever the clip out that secures the flexible hose. There you go. And then you should be able to just pull the flexible hose out through the bracket on the lower wishbone. There you go.
At this point you could, I suppose, just release the inner fixings of the top link and the two inner fixings of the lower wishbone and remove the rest as an assembly and strip it down on the bench if you want, but there's plenty of space to work in here, so there's no particular advantage to doing that, and I like rolling around on the garage floor in filth, so we're going to strip it down on the car. So the next thing we're going to do is release the outboard upper and lower fixings and separate off the hub carrier and disc. Two different types of top link have been used. Early cars used a U-shaped channel, and the camber adjuster in those was an eccentric headed bolt in this sort of position. This type is the later type, which is a tubular top link with an integral camber adjuster which has lock nuts there. The arrangement of bolts and spacers and sleeves is a little bit different on the earlier type, but the idea is much the same. To release the top of the hub carrier, just take the nut and bolt off. Oh, that was done up so tight it wobbled the camera. The inner fixing for the top link is a bolt which bolts into the chassis, and on this side of the car, the left hand side of the car, you access the head of that bolt through a grommet in the front wall of the boot. On the right hand side of the car you just have to sort of work around up behind the silencer for the exhaust. Now if the tightness of the outer one is anything to go by, I'm not looking forward to getting some done. Oh, easy. Then remove the nylock from the rear inboard lower wishbone pivot and loosen the bolt. So just knock the bolt, leave the bolt in there, but just knock it back a little bit so that we can get this strut loose at the top link. And then you can get this strut out of the way, collect that snubber washer that's behind it. And with that out of the way, now we can remove the top link. And then just make a note of your arrangement of spacers and snubber washers and conical spacers, because it varies between the two vintages of car. If you've got the early car, this spacer will be in two parts and there'll be a snubber washer in here, but on late cars there's one spacer which goes right through the hub carrier there, and then this conical washer should come off. There you go, so just collect that and keep it all together. And then the inner bush for the top link has this reducing sleeve in it, so just mind you don't lose that when you take it off. And then we just need to remove the two nylocks on either end of the lower outboard pivot stud. Now everything else in here in the rear suspension is a standard metric course, but these two are 14mm metric fine. They're 14 by 1.5mm if I remember rightly. Anyway, it's a 22mm socket. When you crack them off, just be careful because the hub and disc will then swing downwards, and it's quite heavy, so make sure it doesn't land on you. Alright, so in here we've got snubber washers on the outside. They have a 14mm diameter hole in them, and then if you withdraw the stud and then pull the hub out, there's a pair of snubber washers on the inside, and they have a bigger hole, and they're a 16mm diameter hole, so collect those as well. And then the rear hub and hub carrier, we're just going to remove that to the bench and then we'll strip it down in the vise. And then the last bolt we need to remove is this one, which is the lower wishbone inner forward pivot bolt. Now this one has an eccentric headed adjuster on it, which is used for adjusting the toe in on the rear wheel when we put it back together. So if you're sure your toe is set correctly at the moment, then make a note of the position that eccentric is in before you undo this bolt, and then you can put it back on, and you should have the same toe setting when you put it back together. Don't worry if that doesn't mean much to you. We'll set up suspension geometry in a future video, so we'll adjust this then. But anyway, let's get it off. Again, 19mm socket. And then just remove that rear inboard fixing that we loosened earlier and the strut, and then just manhandle the lower wishbone out of the chassis. There you go, that's half the job done. Now in Harry Potter, they'd probably do it like this, although they probably wouldn't use a drumstick. Repairio! When you're restoring the chassis, give the bottom of the turret there a really good stab with a screwdriver or with a magic wand, because water enters the turret at the top through these holes here and it runs down, and that drain hole which is put at the bottom to allow the water to drain out is too high. It allows about half an inch of water to collect to the bottom of the turret there, so it's a good place for getting a load of crevice corrosion taking place just where the turret joins the main backbone of the chassis. So give it a good stab, make sure it's nice and solid, and thoroughly wax the internal cavity there where the turret meets the backbone. Dismantling the strut is exactly the same procedure as with the front dampers, so we're not going to go over the detail of it here. If you need to know how to do it, just refer to that video when we dismantled the front suspension. But briefly, we just put a pair of spring compressors on the spring, undo the nut from the centre of the damper, and then take off the top spring abutment and then slide the spring off. To replace the rear bearings, obviously you could do this on the car, but I'm doing it on the bench. Prise out the dust cap in the centre of the hub. And then under here will be a split pin. So I'm going to remove that and discard it. Use a new one when you put it back together. And then the castellated nut here should just be finger tight here, if it's been adjusted correctly. Just unscrew that. And then under the nut is a washer with a tongue that fits in a groove on the stub axle there, and then the outer bearing is just behind that. The easiest way of removing it is just to pull the hub off the stub axle, and then the bearing will come away with it. So there's the washer, and then that's the outer bearing behind it. And then if you flip the hub over, the inner bearing is just in here behind this oil seal, so just get an old screwdriver and lever the old oil seal out. And then you can remove the inner bearing. Just a word of caution here, the inner bearing is a really loose fit on the stub axle. It doesn't engage with the taper of the stub axle, and that means it's possible for the complete bearing to turn on the stub axle. And you can see that has been happening here. If you see this discoloration and marking on the journal here, that's evidence that the inner race of the bearing has been spinning around on the stub axle. Just try and illustrate what I mean a little bit more clearly. This is the inner bearing mounted on the stub axle, and what should happen is that the bearing should turn on the inner race there, but because it's such a loose fit, the whole thing is capable of turning on the stub axle, and that marking that you can see on the stub axle is evidence that that has been happening in use. Now you really don't want that to happen. If the race spins around on the journal, it will wring the stub axle out really quickly, and you can't buy these stub axles anymore, so that's a problem we would like to avoid causing. Now fortunately, I know from the service records this bearing was only fitted a few thousand miles ago, so the problem isn't too bad at the moment, but when you're fitting these bearings, use a bearing fitting compound just to glue the bearing onto the journal. If you're going to reuse your bearings, then give them a real thorough inspection. The surfaces should be like that, basically free from any pitting, scoring, galling or scratching. A bit of discoloration, a bit of marking is okay. Also, of course, they should rotate freely. There shouldn't be any dirt in there, and that's the same. You want to check both the races and the actual needles themselves. If there's any doubt about the condition, just replace them. They're not expensive, these bearings. If you need to replace the bearings, then you'll have to remove the outer bearing races from the disc here. Now it's easier to see on the new disc, but if you have a look in there, can you see that there are slots cut into the inside of the hub there, and that's for you to put a drift down so that you can drift the race out. So basically a drift in this case is just an unloved old screwdriver and a hammer, and then just knock them out. And then just give them one blow on each side so you knock it out nice and square. Then we'll go to the other side. There you go. Now the disc is too wide to fit in my press, so we're going to have to do this the ugly way with a hammer and a drift. So get plenty of, firstly clean all the old dirt and dust out of the hub, and then give it a good coating of grease on both the
faces that the race is going to be pressed into and the outside faces of the race. Put the race in a freezer for a couple of hours. That will contract it by about the thickness of a coat of paint, which will make it easier to get in. And the only trick is keeping it square as you drive it home. A little bit more. There you go, it's in. About half fill the hub with fresh grease so the grease has got some room to expand when it heats up, and then repack the bearing with fresh grease and make sure that you get all the needles thoroughly coated with clean grease. Then drop the inner bearing into position and tap home a new seal. If you want to separate the stub axle from the hub carrier, then you need to undo these 4 bolts. Now, because we've got steel bolts and steel stub axles in contact with aluminium alloy here in a wet area, galvanic corrosion is a problem in here, so these are likely to be quite difficult to get out. They're also thread locked, so for that reason, get some heat into them, I would recommend, before trying to undo them. They're all coming. Great. And that's a grade 10.9 bolt. It's a heat hardened bolt, so if you have had to guard it hard with a blowtorch, replace them, because you'll have affected the heat hardening. And the same with the brake hanger. If you want to get that off, get as much of the surface corrosion off as you can, then get plenty of heat into it before going at the Allen heads with a 6mm Allen key. That's a stitching time saves 9 job. Get them out and replace them while you still can, because it's a grade 12.9 bolt, so if you leave it till you can't get them out, drilling it will be all your waking nightmares. We dismantled the left side suspension, but to be honest I hadn't really got enough space to get the camera in there and it was just annoying me, so we're going to rebuild. The right hand side, the idea is exactly the same, it's just we've got the slight added complication of having the exhaust silencer in the way. Start with the suspension strut, do the top nut up to 25 Newton meters and then put the complete strut assembly up into the turret, and then working inside the boot, loosely at this stage refit the 3 8mm nylocks that hold the strut to the chassis. So with the strut hanging loosely, the next thing we're going to do is loosely fit the top link. Now if you have the earlier type U-channel top link, then make sure that the eccentric adjuster is free so that you can adjust the camber after you put it back on. If you've got this tubular type, then make sure the lock nuts are free for the camber adjuster there. With this tubular type, if you have this one, it doesn't really matter which way around you fit this, whether you put the adjuster on the outside of the car or put it towards the inside. Lotus fitted it with the adjuster towards the inside like that. However, if you do that, it's almost impossible to get the lock nuts once it's back on the car because of the exhaust. So I'm actually going to fit it the other way around so the adjuster is towards the outside so we can get at it to adjust the camber after we put it back on. Grease everything up, so grease up the attachment to the chassis, the spigot on the chassis and also the bushes themselves. And the correct orientation for this is M12 70mm long bolt, then there's a plain washer, then that goes through the strut, the stiffening strut. On the back of that is the snubber washer. Then fit the reducing sleeve to the bush in the top link and put all of that through, put the bolt through the reducing sleeve. Then there's another snubber washer on the forward side, and then now all that gets bolted to the spigot on the chassis. You also should Loctite the end of the thread there, because there's no nut on the end of this. For added security, Loctite the end of the thread. And then just mount it to the car. Now we're only going to do it up loosely at this stage. We're only going to do this up fully once we put the car down on the ground and the car's at normal ride height. Cover me, I'm going in! So, snubber over the spigot and then mount the whole assembly to the car.
If you took it off, then refit the anti-roll bar ball joint to the lower wishbone. There's the spacer washer, which goes over there, and the ball joint goes through that. And then it's just secured at the bottom with a 10mm nylock nut, which is done up to 40 Newton meters. Then grease everything up and manhandle the lower wishbone into position. Don't make me get the mallet. There, see, sometimes even a car part needs to be shown a bit of love with a heavy blunt instrument. And we're just going to do the wishbone pivots up loosely at this time until we put the car back down on the ground. But the rear fixing is an M12 75mm long bolt with a washer on it. That goes through the stiffening strut. Through the bush. There's that mallet. Yeah, it's inserted from front to back, so through the stiffening strut, through the wishbone, and then on the back side is another plain washer and an M12 nylock. At the back, grease up the bolt with the integral link centric in it and insert that from back to front. And then we'll worry about setting up the toe when we've got the car back on the ground. We'll do setting up suspension geometry in a future video shortly after we've finished this one. But on the front edge of that adjuster bolt is a snubber washer, and then there's another M12 nylock on the end, and again just do that up loosely at this stage. We'll only tighten these ones up when the car's back on the floor. Reattach the rigid brake line to the inner flexible hose. They're done up to 15 Newton meters, which is firm really rather than gorilla grip tight. While trying to keep your elbow out of the way of the video camera, reattach the damper to the lower wishbone. It's an M12 65mm long bolt, which is inserted from front to back, and then there's a plain washer and a nylock on the end there. And again, we're just going to nip that one up loosely at this stage. We'll only do all of these bolts up when we've put the car back down on the ground. Have I said that already? If you remove the stub axle, then now is the time to replace it. The workshop manual says to make sure that these mating faces and also under the heads of the bolts and the washers are clean. However, because we've got steel in contact with alloy in a wet area here, galvanic corrosion can be a real problem in here, so I'm greasing it, but it's up to you. And then the bolts, thread lock tight the bolts and then do them up to 60 Newton meters. The brake hanger goes on next, and again galvanic corrosion here between the steel and the aluminium alloy is a problem, so I would thoroughly grease the mating surfaces between the two if I were you. I'd also grease underneath the heads of the bolts as well, given the trouble we had getting them off. Don't grease the threads though, because you need to lock tight the threads here. They're done up to a surprisingly tight 35 Newton meters, surprisingly tight given that they're tapped into aluminium, which means you'll need a grade 12.9 bolt. And then just go easy when you're doing these up. 35 Newton meters is tight for an 8mm bolt going into alloy. It is a surprisingly strong alloy, but just be really careful you don't strip it. As you can see, we'll take it. When you go to refit the hub carrier, again use lashings of copper grease on the steel of the pivot stud to prevent galvanic corrosion where it's in contact with the aluminium alloy of the hub carrier. Push the pivot stud in and then fit the snubber washer with the 16mm hole on the inside there. Then mount the hub carrier, push the pivot stud through, and put the other snubber with the 16mm hole between the aluminium of the hub carrier and the eye of the wishbone. Then tap the stud in with a gentle persuader and fit the snubber washers with the 14mm diameter holes, and then fit a new pair of nylocks to the ends of the pivot stud. Now everything else in here in the rear suspension is a standard metric coarse thread, but these ones, the threads on the pivot stud, are a 14mm metric fine. It's a 14 by 1.5mm thread pitch on there. And then just do those up loosely at this stage. And for assembling the top link to the hub carrier, the exact arrangement here will vary depending on what age car you've got, but for late cars like this, then fit the conical spacer over the end of the reducing sleeve there, assemble everything together, and then tap the reducing sleeve through the bush of the top link until it's flush with the alloy of the hub carrier at this end. And again, plenty of copper grease on everything here because we've got steel and aluminium in contact with one another, and then just loosely do that up. Apply the bearing fitting compound to the inner bearing journal. Slip the hub with the inner bearing and the oil seal already inserted onto the stub axle. Then fit the outer bearing. Slide on the tongued washer. And then fit the castellated nut. And then we just need to adjust the bearings. So the way to do that properly is to, with a 24mm socket, tighten the castellated nut. Turn the disc as you tighten the castellated nut up to 25 Newton meters. And you'll feel the disc is now starting to get a bit sticky. That's 25 Newton meters. Now, without disturbing the disc, back the nut off until the nut is loose, but don't disturb the disc. And then from there, all we're going to do is do the nut at finger tight, and then at the moment we can't quite get the split pin in through the castles and through the holes. So you just go, once you've got it finger tight, you're just going to turn the nut clockwise just far enough that you can insert the split pin into the next castle that lines up with the hole. Now the reason for that is that you need a little bit of end float in the bearings. When you do the nut up to 25 Newton meters, you're jamming the needles into the race there. And then when you back the nut off, you're allowing the needles to withdraw slightly, and that's providing the clearance. So you need a little bit of end float in there. However, there shouldn't be so much end float in there that there's any perceptible movement. I mean, the clearance is typically just a few thousandths of an inch. Every castle that you advance here, it's a 1mm thread pitch, and there's 10 castles on the nut. So every castle that you rotate the nut round by is reducing the end float by 4 thousandths of an inch. And so you can see there, with as tight as I can do it with my fingers, we're just not quite able to get the split pin at the moment, so we're just going to rotate clockwise until the castles line up with the hole. Then we can insert the split pin. Put a bit of grease inside and round the lips of the dust seal, both so you can help to get it off next time, and also so it helps to create a watertight seal. Then tap that in place, and then while you're thinking about it, thoroughly degrease your discs. Then refit the anti-roll bar and do new nylocks up for both the drop link and the ball joint itself to 40 Newton meters. If you remove the outer flexible brake hose, then now is the time to refit it, or preferably replace it. What is the point of having a classy sports car like this let down by soggy 20-year-old rubber brake hoses that swell every time you stand on them?
Then reattach the caliper and do the bolts up to 100 Newton meters. Reattach the handbrake cable and the flexible hose banjo. If you haven't touched the caliper while it's off, then the handbrake shouldn't need adjusting, but you might as well pump the lever inside the car a couple of times just to be sure. Then just bleed the air out of the hydraulic system the way we've looked at in previous videos on the braking system. And that's it. Get the wheel back on, let's get the car down on the ground and get those other nuts and bolts torqued back up and the job's finished. Just before you put the car back down, do up the 3 nuts holding the top of the damper to the chassis to 25 Newton meters. So we need to do all those suspension fixings up that we just did up loosely when we were assembling everything. And the reason that we do that with the car at normal ride height is that if you imagine that my hand is one of the rubber bushes in the suspension, then if we clamp everything together with the car at full droop, so imagine I clamp the suspension components together and my arm is one of the wishbones, then when we drop the car down to normal ride height, that bush will be twisted, it'll be preloaded. So that constant torsion on it when the car's sitting at normal ride height will eventually lead to it to tear. So we always clamp up rubber bushes with the car at normal ride height. Now the easiest way of doing that is just put the wheel back on, drop the car back down onto the ground, roll it forward a couple of metres just to settle the suspension, then clamp everything up. But that's quite hard to do because it's quite hard to get at the outer fixings because the wheel's in the way and it would be almost impossible to video. So just to sort of show you this, we're doing it the other way, which is I've got a jack underneath the hub carrier there and we've dropped the car down and then I've just jacked the car up, jacked the suspension up so that it's at normal ride height. Normal ride height is when the lower wishbone is more or less horizontal. Adjust the eccentric adjuster here on the inboard front fixing of the lower wishbone so that the rear wheel is towing in between 1.5 and 2 millimeters. Don't worry, we will look at how to do that, how to set up suspension geometry in a future video, but when you've done that, then torque up the fixing to 65 Newton meters. I will do that off the camera because all you would see would be the back of my head. The same for the rear inner wishbone fixing, 65 Newton meters. For the top link, set the camber up so that it has 1/2 degree of negative camber. That is so the top of the wheel is leaning inwards by 1/2 degree. Again, we'll show you how in a future video. Then just do up the lock nuts firm. Then for the top link, the inner and outer bolts are both done up to 75 Newton meters. And finally, the lower outboard pivot stud nuts, 95 Newton meters. And then just go round and give everything a check because it's very easy to forget one or two. And wheel back on, and despite what your local tyre fitting place might think, wheel bolts only need to be done up to 85 Newton meters. So there you go, that's it. Wheels back on, suspension's done, front and rear. Job is a good one. The only thing that remains is now we've got all the suspension done is to check and adjust the suspension geometry, and that's what we'll be looking at in a future video coming up shortly. Alright, see you next time.